I'm going to go through the evidence about forced organ harvesting, and the way that I'm structuring this is the way that it was structured by the China Tribunal. And the reason I'm doing that is because it then makes it very easy to go to the detail, both written by the China Tribunal, and then from that document back to the original articles, including the video evidence given at the China Tribunal and the written evidence that's collected in the appendices of the published long version. Before I get into the evidence, I'm going to talk a little bit about the terminology of forced organ harvesting, because the language can be a little bit confusing or intimidating if you're not used to it. I'm then going to mention some important timelines in the history of forced organ harvesting before going through the lines of evidence, and I hope we'll have some time for questions at the end. Organ trafficking is central to forced organ harvesting, and organ trafficking is defined in various legal and other instruments as the illicit removal of organs from living or dead persons. So it can be someone selling a kidney, or it can be taking organs from a dead person. The key elements of trafficking is that there's no free, voluntary, informed consent, and it's usually performed for financial or other benefit. Forced organ harvesting is a subset of organ trafficking, a very specific subset of organ trafficking in which a person is killed without their consent, and their organs are taken for transplantation into another person. So they're specifically killed for their organs to be transplanted into another person. Prisoners' organs come up as a regular issue when we're talking about forced organ harvesting. And there's pretty much universal international ethical and professional guidance that forbids taking organs from prisoners. And this is from the WHO, the Transplant Society, the World Medical Association, United Nations, Council of Europe, and so on. So there's a very strong expressed professional guidance that it is wrong to take organs from prisoners. When we're talking about forced organ harvesting, it's important to understand that there are different types of executed prisoners. The prisoners that we're particularly concerned about with forced organ harvesting are prisoners of conscience. Sometimes those are also called political prisoners. So these are people who have been imprisoned either in a formal prison or a black jail or some kind of detention camp, and they have not committed a crime as we would understand that term, and they have not had a trial. So they've been put in prison simply because of beliefs they hold. There are also convicted or criminal prisoners in the Chinese system who also have been subject to forced organ harvesting. And these prisoners have committed a crime, or they've allegedly committed a crime, although it's hard to have confidence in the Chinese legal system. They have been through some form of trial and they are sentenced to death. And for a long time, China did admit that they used organs from executed criminal prisoners. They have, however, always denied that they used organs from executed prisoners of conscience. And those two types of prisoners get conflated. People talk about prisoners and don't make it clear which type of prisoners they're talking about. So it is important to understand that difference between the two types of prisoners. So this is a little bit more medical language. We talk about blood tests. That's an important part of the evidence. So in the context of forced organ harvesting, blood tests is taking blood from people who are in these prisons or camps to screen their blood for infectious diseases, which would prevent them from having healthy organs that could be transplanted, and for also doing types of cross-matching. First blood test is often necessary just to check what a person's blood type is and whether they have any particular antibodies. And then once it's closer to a transplant, further blood is usually taken to make sure that the intended recipient is compatible. And that's a system's called cross-matching. So cross-matching only occurs close to the time of transplant, but the screening blood tests can take time at any place, and that information can be entered into a database so that people running a transplant system would know that they have people of type A blood or people with these type of antibodies in particular places. Organ scanning refers to using medical equipment to test the health of the organs in a living prisoner. And you'll hear there are many accounts of people being subjected to these kind of tests that are particularly just looking at the health of their organs. The waiting list refers to the list of people who need a transplant and who are put in a queue to wait their turn for an organ to be available. So in Australia, where I am, the waiting list for a kidney from a donor who's died is about 3 years. It's coming up to about a year for a liver, and the times are much the same in the UK and I believe in America. And that's a system of that's a feature of voluntary systems. The waiting times for organs are long. The thing that slows down organ transplantation in most countries in the world is that there is a shortage of donors. So people have to wait until somebody who wants to be a donor dies in the right circumstances and can become a donor. And in contrast, in China, we have evidence about a very, very short waiting list. And this is immediately what we call a red flag. How could they have organs available at very short notice when in the rest of the world you have to wait a long time for organs? So the waiting list, understanding what the waiting list is a pretty important part of the evidence. Here I'm just going to talk very briefly about the timelines so that you can put what I'm saying in terms of the evidence that we talk about in context. In the late part of the 20th century, 1980s, 1990s, China had a transplant program, but there wasn't a lot of transplants taking place. There's a fairly small amount of transplant activity. In 1999, the persecution of the Falun Gong started. And from 2000, there was a rapid increase in transplant numbers. Already people started asking questions, where are these organs coming from? Are they coming from prisoners? And at the time, the official Communist Party response was that they are not using organs from prisoners, they were using organs from volunteers. They didn't explain how they could be doing this with no volunteer donor system, but basically we had the situation where there was suddenly a large population of imprisoned people, there was suddenly a large increase in organ transplantations, and there was no explanation of where those organs came from. Under persistent questioning from the international community in 2005 and 2006, there was official admission that the Chinese system was using organs from executed prisoners. However, these prisoners were described solely in terms of prisoners who had been subject to the death penalty, who were executed, and then their organs were taken after they'd been killed for their judicial alleged wrongdoings. There was never any admission about use of organs from prisoners of conscience. Under continuing international pressure, in 2010, Huang Zhufei, who is the leader and the most visible spokesperson for the Chinese transplant system, said that they were starting a pilot volunteer donor program and that they intended to move to a 100% volunteer donor program in due course. So between 2010 and 2015, there is some information put from Chinese sources of the beginning of a volunteer program, but during that time, even according to their own admissions, their prisoner organs were still being used. In 2015, we had the official claim that all organs are now sourced from volunteers. So there was a claimed switch from prisoner organs to 100% volunteer organs. There are a lot of doubts about the veracity of that claim, as I'll discuss briefly later on. But one important kind of feature of that was that prisoners were considered to be volunteers. So initially there was quite a lot of rhetoric around prisoners having rights. Prisoners have the right to donate their organs, and so their organs will be classified along with people who weren't prisoners as volunteers. The statements about that were taken down fairly quickly once people realised that they were very damning, but there was certainly the intention there to keep using prisoner organs, but to call them volunteer organs. Then in 2019, the China Tribunal, having looked at all the evidence, came to the conclusion that forced organ harvesting is continuing. So we have this 20-year trajectory with various bits of evidence, various admissions, various denials, and various concurrent events. But throughout all of that time, it is certainly my own grave fear that forced organ harvesting has happened and is continuing. Okay, so that's a little bit of background, and hopefully that helps to just put everything in context. I'm now going to talk about the lines of evidence as they were described and collected by the China Tribunal. They make an important distinction between two types of evidence. The first is direct evidence, which is witness accounts from people who have actually seen forced organ harvesting happening. And the second type of evidence is indirect evidence. And there are multiple forms of indirect evidence, including all those ones that you see listed there, which I will go through one by one just to give examples of what we mean by each of those types of evidence. So direct evidence is from witnesses, or not witnesses necessarily who spoke directly to the China Tribunal, but any credible reports of first-person involvement in forced organ harvesting. So it might not be people who spoke to the China Tribunal, but where there is credible evidence of people talking about having been involved in it or having seen it. So from the 1990s, a witness whose identity was protected described participating in forced organ harvesting from an incompletely executed prisoner. What we mean by incompletely executed is that the prisoner was shot sometimes in the right side of the chest. So they had a very, very serious injury, but they weren't quite dead. It's not like they'd been shot in the head or shot through the heart. And that meant that they were still alive at the time the organs were removed. There are accounts of Wang Guqi removing skins and corneas from executed prisoners in 1990 and 95. Perhaps the most well-known of these four types of evidence, four sorts of evidence I have here is 2006. A woman called Annie reported that her ex-husband had removed corneas from 2,000 Falun Gong practitioners. So she was describing her husband having said these things. And then from 2003 onwards, Dr. Lee's described the way that live organ harvesting in China has occurred. Perhaps the most well-known direct evidence comes from Enver Tohti, who is a surgeon now resident in the UK. And in 1995, he was a trainee surgeon, and he was asked to come to do a secret, to go on a secret expedition, as I think is how he describes it. And he was taken to an execution ground in Xinjiang and asked to remove the organs from someone who had been shot in the right side of the chest. And as he describes here, the man seems already dead, so I start my incision, cutting his skin. Blood could be seen, so that he was bleeding. If you cut a dead person, they don't bleed. When Dr. Tohti cut this person, he was still bleeding, which implied that he was still alive. But he was told to hurry up and not worry about that. So Enver Tohti's evidence is very compelling, and that's written in full in the China Tribunal. So you can see there's not a lot of direct evidence, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. But what I'm moving on to now is the indirect evidence, and there is a lot of indirect evidence. The China Tribunal describes this in the sort of formal legal terms as referring to witness statements from which forced organ harvesting could be inferred, or hearsay of other sorts, allowing such inferences. That's quite sort of complex legal language, so I find it easier to think about it in terms of the witnesses didn't see forced organ harvesting themselves. They didn't see anyone having their organs cut out, but they saw activities which indicate that forced organ harvesting is taking place, or they heard other people talking about it. So they didn't see it themselves, but the things that they saw and heard implied that it was happening, or showed that it was happening, or helped to support the belief that it's happening. And this is a lot of indirect evidence. So the first is witness accounts, and in the China Tribunal, in this section, there's a lot of material there about witness accounts stemming from sort of the early 2000s right up until quite recently. So, for example, in 2001, a prisoner named Louis Yu Mei was told to give her name and address, or all her organs would be harvested. In 2002, a witness was Lui Hu Guang was told that Falun Gong practitioners are kept as spare goods. One of the most well-known pieces of evidence in these witness accounts comes from Dr. Jacob Levy in 2005. So Dr. Jacob Levy is an Israeli heart transplant surgeon, and he had a patient in Israel who was waiting for a heart transplant, and then he came and saw Dr. Levy one day and said, "I'm going to China for a heart transplant. I'm having my transplant on a date in 2 weeks' time." And Dr. Levy said, "How can this be possible? You can't book a heart transplant in advance unless you know that someone is going to die on a particular day. And the only way that we know that someone is going to die on a particular day is if their death is planned, if they're going to be killed on a particular day." And Dr. Levy's patient went to China and had their heart transplant on the day that was booked in advance. So that was very strong evidence that of people who have been killed on to demand to provide organs for transplantation. In 2006, Dr. Torsten Trey, who is be well known to very many of you as the leader of Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, was told at a medical meeting by a Chinese transplant doctor that all the organs in China come from Falun Gong practitioners. In 2009, the vice president of Medical University told a person called Zhang Guang about a pool of living organ donors, which led to very rapid cross-matching. So again, it's this idea that they've got people who are imprisoned whose organs can be made available very quickly for transplantation. Gulbahar Jelilova spoke to the China Tribunal about her time when she was incarcerated in a prison in Xinjiang, and she reports, amongst other things, sort of medical testing and the disappearance of people from Xinjiang prison and who had been tested. And in 2018, Yukihari Takahashi was told by transplant recipients who had been told that their organs came from executed prisoners. So we have this very long trajectory, nearly 20 years, of people giving very consistent accounts of being told that their organs came from prisoners of conscience, that executed prisoners were used for organs, that this was the reason that the transplant system could work with such short waiting times. In the China Tribunal judgment, all this information is in great detail. I've just sort of summarised some of it very briefly here. The second key piece of evidence is about the medical testing of prisoners. And several China Tribunal witnesses described having blood tests taken for unknown purposes. They didn't know why they were having the blood taken, but they were not able to refuse this. They were held down in some cases and had the blood taken. And other tests that they had while they were prisoners included ultrasound, X-rays, and limited physical examinations. The thing about these tests is that they're looking at specific organs. Ultrasounds are used to look at the kidneys, the liver, they can look at the heart, X-rays can look at the chest. So these are not, if you wanted to find out if a person was healthy or not, you wouldn't go straight to doing an ultrasound on these tests. If you wanted to find out if a person's organs were healthy, these are the kinds of tests that you would do. In no cases did the prisoners give consent, but they were forced to have the tests. And the results were never provided, so they weren't told, "Oh, look, we found a problem with your heart or with your kidneys and we're going to give you some treatment." They were not given any results. And over time, with the people that have been imprisoned over various times during this 20-year period, a very clear picture has emerged that not all the prisoners are tested. So the criminal prisoners who have been sentenced to jail for allegedly performing crimes are not tested, but only the prisoners of conscience, who are mainly imprisoned for religious beliefs. So the Falun Gong practitioners, the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, and some house Christians. So there's quite a distinction here. So the prisoners are treated in different ways, with the criminal convicted prisoners not being tested for blood or having these kinds of tests, but the prisoners of conscience or political prisoners are being tested. And this was going alongside the torture of prisoners of conscience. The China Tribunal noted considerable evidence of torture. And you might say, well, why do we need to know about torture? Torture doesn't, what's that got to do with forced organ harvesting? But it's important to understand the nature and the extent of the torture, because it provides context about the overall treatment of prisoners of conscience. And it provides important information because it makes it very clear that those medical tests were not being done for the good of the person being tested. Normally in medicine, you would only do medical tests on someone to try and treat them, to try and help them. In this case, clearly people who are being tortured, but at the same time having these ultrasounds and blood tests, the treatment is not for them, it's not for their good. It's simply to assess the health of their organs and their potential for being an organ source. Other reasons for documenting and understanding the nature and extent of the torture is because it helps in understanding the full range of crimes that may have been committed. And it reveals the widespread and systematic nature of the persecution. And evidence about torture came from Falun Gong practitioners and Uyghurs. Because the Falun Gong practitioners have been extensively repressed since 1999, there is a longer history of torture, organ testing and so forth of Falun Gong practitioners. The repression of the Uyghurs has a shorter trajectory, so there isn't quite such a length of history. But what is very clear is that what is happening to the Uyghurs is identical to what has happened to the Falun Gong practitioners. And so the two persecutions, the two repressions, the two incarcerations have to be seen as a pattern in which people whose beliefs and practices are counter to the Chinese Communist Party are repressed, put in prison, and then monetized by selling their organs, by killing them and selling their organs. And I think another important thing to note about these two victim groups is the fact that they're likely to have healthy organs, because Falun Gong practitioners don't smoke or drink, and they also try to embrace a healthy lifestyle with the exercises. And Uyghurs who are practicing their faith certainly don't smoke or drink, and so not smoking and not drinking alcohol tend to contribute to having healthy organs, which is very much valued if you're trying to find organs and sell them to people. So that torture it's important understanding that, and if people say, well, in terms of countering people who might challenge evidence, they say, well, maybe they were testing all the prisoners because they needed to find out whether there was infectious diseases in the camps, and you can say, well, no, only the prisoners of conscience were tested, and it wasn't for their health because they were being tortured at the same time that they were being tested. I just want to speak specifically about the incarceration of the Uyghurs, which was another of the lines of evidence that the China Tribunal looked at. And as with the evidence of torture, evidence of incarceration or imprisonment provides context and demonstrates the systematic nature of the Uyghur repression. In giving evidence to the China Tribunal, 6 Uyghur described their imprisonment in the labour camps or lager camps, including things like being required to sing, red songs in praise of the Communist Party, being required to speak only Mandarin, and being punished for speaking their own language or doing anything that referred to their own customs and beliefs. They witnessed and suffered torture, and they had blood and medical tests. So this is very direct evidence, very recent evidence that was given to the China Tribunal. In addition, there's public information and public knowledge about the mass blood and DNA testing in Xinjiang, where a very large number of the entire population of the province have had blood and DNA testing. And again, this testing was not done on a voluntary basis. And I'm not aware that anyone has been offered healthcare in response to the results of those tests. So again, it seems that the tests are not being done for their benefit, which is usually the only reason for doing a medical test. And in addition, there are credible reports of forced organ harvesting from Uyghur people, from Dolken Isa, from Edward Macmillan Scott, and from Ethan Gutman. And Ethan will be presenting his evidence at the next webinar in this series, and that's very recent and very compelling evidence. I'm now going to turn to the phone calls, which is another of the lines of evidence that the China Tribunal looked at. So since 2006, when the first report by David Matus and David Kilgore came out, various investigators have made phone calls to Chinese hospitals posing as patients who need organs. So these are Mandarin-speaking investigators in general, and they ring up and a hospital and say, they have some results that they might tell the doctors who answer the phone, or to say they need an organ or their relative needs an organ, to try and find out what those doctors will say and to see whether they'll talk about where the organs come from. As I said, there's been a large number of these phone calls over the years, and there's been relatively consistent admission that Falun Gong practitioners were used as organ sources. On occasion, people have been offered organs specifically from Falun Gong practitioners. They've stated they use live organs from prisoners, which indicates that instead of, as in a Western system, you wait for the person to die and then take their organs, that basically the organs are being removed as the person is still alive and are in actual fact the cause of death. More recently, people on answering these phone calls have refused to divulge the source of organs. I think it's it's become apparent that it's not a good idea to answer the phone and talk about where the organs come from, that this can cause problems for themselves. This is just an example of one of the phone calls from 2017, from the 26th of May 2017, to the director of a hospital about a kidney transplant. This is just a very short extract. So Wang, who's the director, says, "It will be within half a month, within 2 weeks." And the investigator says, "So you can still find that kind from the prison?" And Wang says, "You need to find the ones under 30 years old." And he goes on to confirm that the hospital circumvents or gets around the official Red Cross organ distribution system. Remember, this is 2017. In 2015, the Chinese Communist Party announced that only volunteers would be used. But here they say they're getting around that volunteer system. They're carrying out hundreds of procedures, and they have their own channels to source organs. And then he goes on to say that young person kidneys, that's people under 30 years, kidneys from people under 30 years old, are available within 10 days. So that seems very clear account of still being able to get organs very quickly on demand, and specifying the kind of person that the organ comes from, namely a young person under 30 years of age. Now, there have been various questions over the years about the phone call evidence. How can you rely on this, or what weight can you put on this? How do you know that the people who answer the phone were who they said they were? How do you know they're not just saying what they think the person wants to hear, and so forth? And these are all very good questions. And this evidence has not necessarily been collected in a way that you would do if you were doing a formal research project approved by an ethics committee and following strict methods. But nonetheless, bearing in mind those potential doubts, the China Tribunal concluded the calls were made as described, and the translations are accurate. They were given translations. And these were verified, the translations were verified by 2 independent people, and voice matching was done for some of the calls. And the hospitals were offering organs for sale from living people available at short notice, and agents of the state were involved. And there are further calls from last year, and these are awaiting translation and verification. But basically, again, we have a 20-year history of Chinese hospitals apparently being willing to offer organs at very short notice from young people. Scale of transplant activity. This is the next line of evidence. This is important because it indicates that there was and is a plentiful supply of organs. You can only transplant as many organs as you have. And this research was collected by David Matus, David Kilgore, and Ethan Gutman, and published in 2016. And they looked at the number of hospitals, transplant beds, numbers of transplant performed, and their estimate was that it was more than 60,000 transplants a year. And of course, the donor numbers and origin have not been revealed by the Chinese state up until 2015, when they started to publish some data. So this is the what we call the official Chinese data, although we should have quotation marks around official because it certainly seems unlikely to be true. But you can see up until 2015, the numbers are hazy. They weren't really confirmed. From 2016 onwards, there's the Chinese do say how many organ donors they had and the number of transplants, which is far less than the 60,000 that can be inferred from the amount of transplant activity. And what's interesting about this data about how many transplants are is it's all announced in the newspapers or at a conference. It's not what you'd call official data. In 2019, the International Registry on Organ Data and Organ Donation and Transplantation did publish data from China, and that's those numbers in blue on the 2019 line. And interestingly, the numbers seem to have fallen off a little bit since 2018, but I haven't heard the numbers announced in the media for 2019, so they might be higher than that. But you can see there is a big discrepancy between what the Chinese say is happening and what can be inferred from all the transplant activity. And if we look just at one transplant centre, the Oriental Organ Transplant Centre in Tianjin, they have the capacity to do 6,000 to 8,000 transplants per year, which would be like a third of what the Chinese are claiming the transplants are. And this is only one of hundreds of hospitals that do transplants in China. And people talk about doing tens of thousands of patients receiving transplants at their hospital. So when you look at in detail, as Kilgore, Gutman and Matus have done, you can see that there is a vast amount of transplant activity going on. And in 2015, and remember this is the month, this is the very time when they'd switched from a prisoner, allegedly claimed to have switched from a prisoner system to a volunteer system. They say that donor bodies are abundant. There aren't that many hospitals and that many doctors that can perform transplant. This is an astonishing thing to say because everywhere around the world, the thing that limits numbers of transplants is the donors. And here Huang Jufei is saying in public that they've got plenty of donors. The problem is they don't have enough hospitals and doctors. A very, very unusual statement to make. Short waiting times, I mentioned these already, but what is critical to understand with short waiting times is that they cannot occur in voluntary systems because a voluntary system relies on waiting for someone who wants to be a donor to die. So they might die in a car accident, they might die of a stroke, but you're waiting. And that's why these waiting lists are so long, because you can't predict when people are going to die, and you obviously can't make them hurry up and die because you want their organs. The voluntary systems rely on the accidental, unpredictable deaths of donors. So you cannot book a transplant in advance from a deceased donor in a voluntary system. So when we have a system like in China where you can have short waiting times and you can book a transplant in advance, this is very strong evidence that organs are available on demand. And the only way organs can be available on demand is if there's a group of living people who can be killed to get their organs to order. So very important to understand about the significance of the short waiting times. It is just not possible to have such short waiting times and pre-book transplants in a voluntary system. And I've mentioned already the pre-scheduled operations, including the cardiac transplant and the short waiting times. They are very, very short. The next piece of evidence is about the official Chinese data that I showed you on that previous slide. And Matthew Robertson, Raymond Hind, and Jacob Levy have done a very extensive analysis of the official deceased organ donation data. And based on that, they came to the conclusion that the data is falsified, that we cannot believe it. Now, this was a very strong claim to make, and so the China Tribunal interrogated this evidence very carefully. They had it in, they had the paper and the calculations checked by Sir David Spiegelman, who's the UK's leading biostatistician, and he was confident that they hadn't made any errors and that the conclusions followed from their methods. So this is, again, it's evidence that that when people come and say, well, the Chinese, this is what the Chinese data is, it's like, well, we actually can't believe that data, there's evidence that it's been falsified, and we can't believe it without having much more transparency. The last piece of indirect evidence that I'm going to mention is transplant tourism. So transplant tourism is where someone from another country, from Korea or Australia or Canada or Europe, goes to a different country to get an organ. And this happens because they're on the waiting list in their own country and they know it'll be a long time before they get an organ, and if they're waiting for a liver, for example, or a heart, it's possible they may die before an organ's available. And so they choose to go to another country to have a transplant. During the early and mid-2000s, there were a lot of advertisements on Chinese hospital websites encouraging foreigners to come and have transplants. Those websites have largely come down, but there still is transplant tourism, despite this being apparently prohibited by Chinese law or regulation. So in 2017, a Korean TV station did an investigation at Tianjin Central Hospital, a very big transplant centre. And there, the transplant centre staff said that the wait times for organs range from days to weeks. And if you gave a donation, you could get your transplant more quickly. And they said that they had, the hospital had an international department, and it had performed 8 transplants on the day before the journalists went there. There are ongoing evidence about transplant tourism. I recently spoke with an Australian surgeon who had looked after a patient in Southeast Asia who had been to China for a transplant. This is well past 2015, when the system allegedly had changed to volunteer donors for Chinese citizens only. So people being able to come to China, having booked their transplant in advance, is evidence that there is somebody who can be killed to give their organ to that person. So based on all of that evidence, the China Tribunal concluded that forced organ harvesting has been committed for years and on a significant scale. There's no evidence that this significant infrastructure has been dismantled. So they say that it's continuing to this day. And they found that commission of crimes against humanity against the Falun Gong and Uyghurs. I know Susie took you through the China Tribunal website last time, so I won't spend any more time on that. So just to wrap up, I want to just talk a little bit about this. It is complex, difficult evidence, and thank you for staying with me this long. And it's hard to sort of organise it in a way that you can present easily to people without getting bogged down in the details. So first of all, I think about it as a mystery. How could China do so many transplants? And we know they do so many transplants because of the hospital activity. And we know there's something very strange about their system because they can do transplants on demand and they have these very short waiting times. So we have evidence of a big lot of transplant activity. And then it's like, well, how could you do that? You need a lot of organs to be able to do that many transplants. And so the question goes, where do all the organs come from? And here we have the coincidence of the incarceration of the prisons of conscience, initially the Falun Gong practitioners, increasingly the Uyghur population, who are tested in medical care, tested while they were being incarcerated. They're not given any medical care, and people just disappear from those camps and are never heard from again. The China Tribunal found this to be strong evidence There's limited direct evidence. We don't have people coming and saying, yes, I cut open this person, I took out their organs, it killed them. And this is because in a way it's a perfect crime. The person who is killed just disappears, and sometimes their relatives don't even know what camp they were in. They don't know what's happened to them. They don't know whether they're dead or alive. Their organs are put into people who leave the hospital, and their bodies are often cremated in the hospital crematorium. And the only other people involved are implicated in the crime because it's the doctors and medical staff involved in the actual transplant. And so there's nobody who could have seen it other than the people actually doing it. And the penalties for a practicing Chinese surgeon or theatre staff to come forward and say, yes, I saw this and it's happening, would just be horrendous for that person. And you can understand why people aren't coming forward. But despite that, there are the multiple lines of indirect evidence. And I put up this quote from Andrew Koo, who is a member of the China Tribunal. And he makes much the same point. We don't have first-hand testimony because the victims are all dead. But he talks about the different lines of evidence, the ones I've already been through. And he makes, I think, this very valuable point that the overall value of the collective body of evidence is greater than the mere sum of its parts. So yes, you could question one line of evidence, or you could question another line of evidence, but when you put them all together, they create a very heavy, very significant body of evidence that all fits together and all points in the same direction. And as Andrew says, the individual lines of evidence describe planned, systematic, institutional and intentional organ harvesting. It's a lot of evidence all coming to this same conclusion. As I've mentioned, it is difficult evidence to talk about because it's so overwhelming. It's so horrific to people who aren't familiar with the whole facts about organ harvesting. And so I think there's just a few, I guess, tips about communicating is that it's much better to try and inform people and persuade them. So to tell them what the evidence is and tell them without exaggerating it, because 2 or 3 bits of very clear, very strong evidence are better than claims about hundreds of people did this, or there was vague claims aren't very persuasive or aren't very informative, but very accurate and detailed claims are much more informative. And talk about the reasons for the lack of direct evidence, that the victims are all dead and the only other people are perpetrators. And I think refer people to the reports and publications, particularly the China Tribunal, but also the update and that paper by Robertson, Hind and Levy. There are a few very key pieces of evidence that people can read for themselves and understand why this evidence is compelling.